Waiting for these.
There we go. Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. Um, in a new apartment. So I am right at the outset. I am saying whatever weirdness has happened today. I'm here. I'm trying for you. I can't vouch for anything. So this is definitely the first time I've done any kind of internet anything in this apartment. So we're going to be talking about presidential legacies today, but before we talk about presidential legacies today, I turn to my wonderful partner in crime, Annie, who will explain the rules of the game.
Oh, good morning, everybody. I am Annie Evans from New American History, and I am in my frosty house outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, where we are gearing up for round number two of a big snowstorm. So I'm delighted to be home. It took me 2 extra days to get home this week from the AHA conference because of the snow. Um,
Oh,
but if you got to be stuck, folks, get stuck in New York City because it's a good place to get stuck for a couple of days.
so
I should have come over and helped you pack, Joanne. I was
I totally forgot that the AHA, like I just was in
there.
no land. Yeah.
There, and several of us got to stay an extra day or two because all the trains and planes were canceled.
Wow, I missed that entirely.
Yep. But it was great. So here's how this works. If you tuned in for the first time today, wow, you picked a great one because this is our 250th. Yes, 250, 250th anniversary episode. We've been doing this for a long time, folks. We are a community who gets together here every Friday, and Joanne's going to talk for about 30 minutes about today's topic. While she's doing that, feel free to engage in the chat. I will come back in about 30 minutes, and where I will look for your questions about today's topic is down below in that Q&A box. That's where I'm going to look for those. So please do add your questions as Joanne is talking, and we will unpack them in a few minutes. I'll see you all in a little bit.
Don't use the word unpack. I know.
Sorry, sorry.
Okay, that's okay. I don't know if any of you ever saw the New Yorker cover, where they had someone like beaming in all dressed up into a Zoom conversation, and all around her were like, boxes and newspapers and cat food and pajamas and everything. And I've identified with that for a long time, but this is a whole new, new level. Yeah. So at any rate, as I said at the outset, um, this is the our 250th episode, man. Amazing. But it's the first episode in this apartment. And so many things are discombobulated, including me. So so I apologize in advance for any of the discombobulation here. Um, at any rate, today, presidential legacies. As ever, I got to Thursday and thought, and it in the distant past, maybe towards the beginning, it wasn't as easy necessarily to like know topics or have topics at hand. Nowadays, we just have too many topics at hand, and the question is, which one do we pick? There were several that crossed my mind. I will confess that I was thinking for a little while about Greenland and Canada and Panama, and I came up with the title American Expansion for Dummies. But and that might come back. But then I realized that we are in this presidential moment on so many levels. We have a new president coming along. We have still, and what set me off really on this topic for today was the number of articles that are still floating around out there about what a horrible disaster President Biden was as a president, which I disagree with. But that certainly set me off thinking about how people are summing up his presidency and deciding what his legacy will be, which made me want to talk about it. So we have Trump coming, we have Biden stepping down, and then former President Carter died, and we have his funeral, which I think was yesterday. So um, there's a lot of presidential stuff going on. And then this morning, in preparation for what we're talking about here today, I glanced at the some of the footage of Jimmy Carter's funeral. I encourage you, if you have not seen this, uh, go and find it and find some with the commentary because there were five former presidents, five, sitting in a row. And I guess I watched Joanne Reed. I stumbled across her commenting on the interaction between the presidents and who greeted who and who didn't greet who and who stood for who and who refused to stand for who. And it was fascinating. But if you weren't convinced that we should be talking about presidencies and presidential legacies, that funeral will do it. Um, I'll leave you to imagine who refused to stand for who and who refused to look at who. And I will say, because it didn't appear, Joanne Reed didn't comment on it, but I noticed it right off the cuff because it's the sort of thing a knowing husband does and a very aware wife does. Kamala Harris and Doug Emhoff. Um, behind them was a row of presidents, and Donald Trump was at one end, and that row was full. So Kamala Harris and her husband came in and sat in front of the president row, and what would have been one of the seats directly in front of Donald Trump. And when you see them enter in, you see Kamala Harris very quietly usher her husband to sit in front of Trump, even though they were not in that order when they went into the row. I appreciated that. Um, Very few people engaged with former and future President Trump. Anyway, I encourage you to find that if you want to think about legacies and how they're judged and how they're judging each other and everything else and the history of presidencies of the past. Mrs. Pence refused to stand. I mean, the whole thing. I encourage you to just go find it. And uh, Joy Reid did a wonderful job. Also, I think the Daily Show had a great commentary on it as well. At any rate, the point is, presidential legacies is what something I think we need to talk about. And in part, and when I posted that, someone out there in social media land, whose last name is also Freeman, but no relation, said, also, you have to talk about why that matters. Because does it matter? And I thought that's a wonderful question. Because one might ask, who cares? In a sense, one might ask. I'm going to show you why I think that's not correct to ask, but one certainly could ask, who cares? In part because we think about presidential legacies, or at least when I think about that, the first thing that pops into my mind is the lists, the top 10 presidents and, the presidents ranked. And I don't know if it's every year that like historians of all kinds get these, you know, quizzes like rank the presidents in order and then they tell you the best and the worst and then randomly during presidential debates people throw out the fact like I was the number one president, well I'm above you in popularity. Anyway, if that's all that this meant, then indeed presidential legacies don't matter. um, but that's not all that it means, particularly in the times that we live in when the office itself is, how do I want to say this? I was going to say in transition, but that's not the word. Being defined and redefined and redefined in potentially, particularly right now, in potentially dramatic ways. I'll just toss out the phrase presidential immunity as one example of ways in which this position is being redefined and has been potentially in beyond a dramatic way. I've talked about this before. I won't go into detail, but the idea that presidential immunity has anything to do with the founding generation, the founders, the Constitution, or anything else along those lines, go find the amicus brief that the Brennan Center corralled and organized of historians, and they will give you, I signed on to it, a very clear indication of why presidential immunity has like no history in American history, and certainly not in the founding. But so that right there redefined the presidency, and as far as I'm concerned, kind of redefined the nation and democracy as well. That's a different conversation. But at any rate, my larger point here is we're at a moment where the presidency, we're going to be watching and seeing how it's people are attempting to redefine it. We may ideally be resisting some of that attempted redefinition. But part of why looking at presidential legacies matters is because in doing so, we are taking stock not necessarily of the individuals holding the office, but the office itself. Now, certainly, we can talk about, the presidency of Jimmy Carter and the presidencies, the terms of Donald Trump and Biden's presidency. I'm going to touch on all of those. But my larger point today is presidential legacies matter because that's how we evaluate the office. When we're judging someone and saying we like what they did or we didn't like what they did or why didn't they do this or they didn't do this well, underlying that is us deciding what the presidency should be and should do. And that is really important. And we have learned many lessons in the recent and semi-recent past, but one of them is we need to not take things for granted in the way that our government works. Even the most basic thing, what is the presidency? Do we have democracy? Some pretty fundamental things that probably many people thought in the course of their lifetime they might not have to think about seriously, and we do. So at any rate, that's what I want to talk about, and I want to talk about how we judge legacies. And in a sense, even just looking at Carter and Trump and Biden, they're great examples of three ways in which we judge presidencies that say something about the office and about the simple fact that, obviously, for better and worse, sometimes what you do as president, you don't get credit for or you get blamed for. We don't evaluate the legacies of presidents, apparently, in this moment, by looking at what they did. We, at the moment, there seems to be a lot of attention being paid as to what people recognized presidents for doing. But let me start first by going back to President Carter, who, and I'm sure, given his death, you've heard this already said many, many, many times, that he's probably our finest ex-president because he went on to a life of public service after his presidency. And you can agree or disagree with some of what he did, but just going on in his humble way to do what he thought was right to do, and fueled by his own power, not doing so for grand applause in any way, but just being an ex-public servant, acting in whatever way he thought best, what as an ex and ongoing public servant. That was there. It was admirable. It wasn't about looking for an audience. It wasn't about playing to the crowds. He went on to do what he thought was right. I think this is correct. I didn't get to look it up. I didn't get to look a lot up this morning because I was hunting for the lights, and that a lot of my prep time went out the window. But I believe, and I'm sure someone will correct me in our wonderful knowing community, I believe that the Carters were the first people to step out of the limousine on their way to the inauguration and walk part of the way. Um, just, being sort of humble and of the people, and that after that it became something of a tradition. Someone can correct me. Mr. Carter, I see someone saying was one of the original. I'm not supposed to be looking at chat. Okay, thumbs up. At any rate, that to me is typical of the sort of person he was in office. Now, we could sit here and debate what he did do or didn't do well as president, and that is one way to judge, and it's a totally fair way to judge a presidency, a legacy. What did this president accomplish? What did this president not accomplish? How well or not so well were they in accomplishing or not accomplishing these things? That's totally valid. But I also think a presidential legacy, in part, and I think Carter is an example of that, can also be summed up or at least measured by the spirit of the person in office. And I don't mean spirit necessarily in a religious way. I just mean, in his case, someone who understood that he was a public servant. We live in a time when not a lot of people seem to be remembering the fact that the servant part of the job of being a president or being in public office matters, that you're supposed to serve the public and not necessarily yourself. So Jimmy Carter, I mean, first of all, we call him Jimmy. Jimmy Carter, the spirit with which he held that office, the servant part of public servant, he had that ethos, I think, very clear and present. And I think that matters. So if you're trying to sum up that presidency, the spirit of that presidency would be one way to do it. Again, you totally can judge what he did or didn't do and how did he deal with the hostage crisis and all of these things. But I think the way in which he embodied that office matters and should be part of his legacy. And I use the word embodied. And as I said that, I realized it's important to note the presidency is both an office that's involved in doing the business of the presidency, and then it also obviously has a symbolic component to it as well. That you're a sort of figurehead in addition to being a leading statesman, and both of those things matter. So anyway, one way to judge a legacy is the spirit with which a presidency was imbued and what kind of a leader and what kind of a public servant that president was, and in what spirit did he and someday she lead the nation. That's one way. I think another way to judge a presidency, and we're going to sort of segue here to President Biden, um, is by actually evaluating the things that the president did in office. Now, I I would have, if I had more time and wasn't searching for the lights and hoping that my internet would work, I would have actually made a list of the things that President Biden did in office because far and away, he accomplished a lot in office and got credit for very little of it. And part of that is the weirdness of the press in this moment and what the press has chosen to cover or not cover. The fact that they were obsessed with his age. Now they're obsessed with the fact that he ran for president. And people are branding that his legacy. His legacy will be he should have stepped down. Well, no, that's part of his legacy. But let's look at what he did as president, right? If you're judging the legacy of a presidency, look at the presidency. What he did in deciding whether to run again or not to run again, that's part of how you judge a presidency, but that's not the sum total of a presidency. And that, I suppose, is what got me irked enough to decide that this was the moment we needed to talk about this. Then the funeral sort of drove that message home. But still, the number of articles, there was one in recent weeks that I think used the word monster because he decided to run again. Come on, folks. We can talk about monsters. That is not the word to apply to President Biden. We can say he shouldn't have run, that, blame him for any number of things, your choice, you do it. But he accomplished a lot as president, and he accomplished a lot as president, mopping up a lot of what happened in the presidency before him. He didn't get credit for much of it. The press didn't pay attention to much of it. His team, I would say, does not, and I speak without, again, having prepared myself, but his team does not appear to have been particularly skilled at getting public recognition for what he was doing. But I think if you're judging a president who took office at a really difficult time, with a kind of, in many ways, unprecedented presidency before him and a who the heck knows what presidency to come, he was a stabilizing force. He worked hard. He got things done up until the moment when he was, just now about to not be president. And even now, he's still like confirming judges. Um, I think if you're judging a president's legacy, in his case, he gets credit for being a president who accomplished a lot, worked for the stability of the nation, and kept doing it and kept working hard, despite the fact that no one appears to have really been noticing what he was doing. And he wasn't hiding and he wasn't skulking, trying to do things in secret. He was just trying to stabilize things, do his job. If you want to judge the ways in which he was or wasn't preparing the nation for what's to come, that's a valid way to judge part of his legacy. I totally understand those who are saying, why is he making this transition so smooth? That's a different conversation. Why is he smiling and, welcoming President Trump into office? That's a big conversation. Maybe we can have that at another point. But regardless, my larger point is, if Carter is an example of how you can judge a presidency based on the guiding spirit and ethos of a president, you can judge a president based on the work that that president actually did, even and maybe particularly if he or she didn't get credit for it. Another way that you can judge a president, I see a little American flag floating up. The fact that you guys can make emojis float up on the screen, it's just dangerous. At any rate, dangerous for me because then I'm very easily distracted. But so let's talk about another kind of way to judge a presidency. And I would say you can do that thinking about precedents and standards and norms and ways in which you remodel the presidency um, in your own image in some ways, right? Not necessarily thinking of the larger impact of what you're doing, but thinking about the immediate impact of what you're doing. And obviously, I'm speaking about former and future President Trump. Some of what he did, all of we've talked before, and I don't remember when, maybe more than once, about norms and about how we learned during the Trump presidency that there are all of these things that are norms that we didn't think of as norms because we did what you do with norms. You just took them for granted that that's the way things operate. And then suddenly they didn't operate that way, and you realize, oh, this isn't a rule, this isn't a law. There's nothing about this that is necessarily being enforced. It's just the way it always happened. And now suddenly it's not happening that way anymore. So there were a lot of norms, both big and small, that were violated during Trump's presidency. Some of them were, I think, spur of the moment, impulsive things that he did that had a bigger impact that he didn't necessarily think about. Some of them had a bigger impact very much that he wanted to think about that had to do with him and the presidency and the way the world was judging him. But certainly, what he thought of the office, what he was doing with the office, not the spirit of it and not the acts, but the way in which he defined the presidency and will be defining the presidency. Um, that's another way you can judge a president. And the impact, that's in a sense the most traditional way to judge a legacy is once a term is done to look back and see what the impact is. Um, and again, I am in pontificating in this way before you this morning. I'm not and never claim that like I have the only way to judge this and I have the only answer. The thing about legacies is we can discuss them and people will have different views, and that's okay. What's important is that we think about it and we don't let former presidents drift off into the past without thinking about the impact of what their time in office did. In the case of President Trump, his time in office, let's just say, didn't do a lot for the unity of the nation. I could say a lot, but let's just say he defined that office, and I believe is planning to do that again around himself. The office was about him. And in preparing for his presidency and seemingly judging people who are going to fill spaces based on their personal loyalty to him and not based on the fact that, for example, they are federal employees who stay in office and aren't serving one or another party or one or another president, but instead are, civil servants in office who are there not to serve a person, but to serve the public and the government. If you're planning to oust those people and put loyalists in their place, that says something about how you are defining the office, and it suggests you're defining the office around yourself in a very personal, specific way that has to do with you, period. That's it. So we're watching, the former Trump presidency, we can certainly talk about the legacy. And in my eyes, maybe the positive thing about that presidency was getting us to really think about the presidency and what it is and what it should be, and democracy and what it is and how it needs protecting. Those are not necessarily things tests you want to be thrown out at you at a given moment, but there we are. But again, what are seeing now and plans for the next presidency appears to be a more extreme version of the presidency equals me and what I want and my friends and what they want, and that's it. Um, that will be a way in which we can judge his legacy. It'll be based on the past term and the coming term, what he's doing, the spirit in which he's doing it, the ways in which he is or isn't serving the public. Again, I suppose I'm laying out an index of ways you can judge a presidency and encouraging you, and this is in the spirit of what I've said before. I'm sure I'm going to come back to it because I think it's really, really important. And that is, I've talked about why the Democrats, I think, need to be really an opposition party, meaning not politics as normal, meaning not normal party politics, meaning reorganizing and defining themselves around really watching what's going on, advertising what's going offering alternatives, having people specifically shadow cabinet focused on what different aspects of the government are doing so that we know that and know the impact. It's a totally different spirit. I encourage you to find our former episode when we talked about this. My colleague Tim Snyder talked about this on Rachel Maddow's show. Jamel Bowie talked about it in a New York Times editorial. At any rate, a lot of commentators of various sorts are talking about it. I think it's important. But that is a way in which that links with what we're talking about now, because what that is asking people to do is to watch what a presidency is adding up to and not wait till the end to declare the legacy, particularly at this moment. We need to be in the moment. We need to be in the moment watching what's happening and responding in real time with action and with words. This is where we are. And there are any number of ways in which we can talk about what's shaping up to be extremely alarming, a new oligarchical way of running this country. Not new, but let's say more extreme oligarchical way of running the country. I could go on. I keep pulling myself back because I have so much I could say about so many things that I am feeling so powerfully emotional about. But I see I'm a minute over already. For the purposes of this conversation, I encourage you to think about the office of the presidency. Think about the way in which you are judging presidencies, not based on who's better and worse, not based on a sort of generic, here's what I think of this presidency, not only based on the mistakes they made in office or the wonderful things that they did in office, but based on the spirit with which they ran the office, the acts that they did or didn't do in office, whether they were or were not serving the public in office. Think about what that moment in time, that presidency added up to. And that should be part of how we're judging presidents. It's not a popularity contest. Legacy shouldn't be about popularity contests. The way you judge, I think, particularly in this historical moment, the way you judge a presidency and its legacy is what does it add up to as far as the office and our government is concerned? What does it say about who we are as a country and where we're headed? Presidential legacies matter. Going back to my non-relative, I think his first name is John Freeman, on one social media platform, who said, why does this matter? Matters a heck of a lot right now. And that is because we are watching the presidency has been and will continue to be attempted to be transformed. Judging legacies is a way of defining the office for ourselves. And that really, really matters, not just for our own personal opinion, but in what we judge to do, how we come together, how we choose to speak up, how we choose to act, who we choose to support. In a moment when the presidency is, there will be attempts to redefine it in a dramatic and, in my point of view, really dangerous way. That's why presidential legacies are important to think about. Okay. I am, let's see, mug, thank you. So here, the dread secret of this episode is, normally I have my notes and I have them and I cover up the chat so that I can't get distracted. And I was running around so much like crazy today that I didn't have time to prepare. I had no notes. I know he wouldn't know. I had no notes. And so I could see the, mug. At any rate, this will not be a surprise. I'm getting my lipstick off. The mug, because I have used it before. But I will. And this was a gift. I can't remember who gave me this. If someone would actually let me put chat on so I can now see who's talking. If someone will tell me who gave me this, I think this was from the NCHE
I think
conference.
so too. I just can't remember who it was.
Yeah. If you reveal yourself, and I should also say, and I didn't say it at the outset, and I realized once I gotten going, that if you're here for the first time, folks,
Wow.
first of all, wow, I know this is
A
not,
great one.
it is. and a little not normal, but if you're here for the first time, say something in chat, because this is an amazing community. And if you say I'm here for the first time or one of the first times, you will get a robust welcome from this amazing, amazing community. I should have said that at the beginning. At any rate, yes, see, we're already getting welcome to all first timers. First timer makes you feel like, yes, I'm an old timer, but first timers, at any rate, it's whoever. Oh, there you go, Kate. Katie. Katie is here for the first time. Um, at any rate, this someone could pipe up and offer um, take credit for that. Better than a last timer. Oh, Cherie, your first time? Look at that. Welcome. Katie, I know. Um, and Katie, it's wonderful that you're here. But anyway, yeah, wonderful for people. I'm glad you came. We have so much to talk about. We don't run out of things to talk about on History Matters. 250 times. I know. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking, and we can have some time for question and answer.
And we've got some good ones. And the chat's been crazy busy since you were talking. So um, I can't believe you did that with no notes. That's incredible.
Well, I can't either because as it was beginning, I was like, uh-oh.
No, it was just what we needed today. That's what I'm going to say about that. Okay, our good friend Sydney, who is off to return to college for the next semester tomorrow. Sydney is down in Georgia in the Atlanta area, and she and I visited the Carter Center together last summer. So I'm going to let her question be first in honor of being from Georgia
Yeah,
and
high school,
with me and a college
a college
student
student.
and a local.
And
He says how someone feels about a president depends on their view of what is good or bad. So keeping that in mind, what makes a universally legendary president like Jimmy Carter?
well, and
Mm.
that's a really good point. And it's, depending on your politics and your views and your values, obviously that's going to judge your sense of a president and their legacy. And I'm not saying that that shouldn't be the case. Of course, that's going to be the case. Repeat to me the wording that you just gave me of that question.
He said that most people, the way they feel about the president depends on that the person's version of what's good and bad. And so, what makes someone like Jimmy Carter a universally legendary president is what she's asking.
I mean, I would say one thing, and this is going to be easier for me to say than to prove or to talk to you about how to point it out, but a president who clearly is not just thinking about themselves. I mean, when you ask, I would assume when you ask the average American who is a great president, and they're going to say Abraham Lincoln and maybe Thomas Jefferson and maybe George Washington and depends on their politics, maybe FDR, I don't know, right? They're going to say any number of things, but probably Lincoln for a lot of people, maybe Kennedy. The same names come up that people say are great presidents. And part of that, FDR really depends on your politics, but some of the others, Lincoln was someone who certainly was president at maybe the most trying time, one of the most trying times in American history, if not the most trying time. But you didn't get the sense that Lincoln was trying to serve Lincoln. You got a sense that he was trying to address the public need. You might not agree with the way he did it. You might not agree with the actions he took. But I think the fact that you can see, again, Jimmy Carter, we can say that some of what he did, we really don't like what he did. But did we get the sense that he was serving his ego or his bank account or himself really in a blatant egocentric kind of a way? You got the sense that in to the whatever ability he had, the best of his abilities, he was doing what he thought best in the moment for the good of the country. So on a fundamental, it shouldn't need to be said. But the fact of the matter is, if you can look at a president and say, I may not agree with some of what that president did, but at the very least, I can say that that person appeared to be thinking about the national good. That's the beginning. That's the starting point. You can back yourselves into all kinds of corners. You can say, well, a president who decides that no immigrants should be allowed into this country because it's for the good of the country. That's not an easy, you know, that president may be doing it for reasons they think are good, and that could be a sincerely, seemingly un-American or not a thing to do or a thing that is not going to serve the American good. So what I'm saying are certainly not hard and fast rules, but certainly a starting point for judging would be again, I guess that gets back to again Jimmy Carter, the spirit with which that person is serving in office and whether they are sincerely doing what they are supposed to be doing as president, which is thinking about the nation and the good of the nation, all of the nation, all Americans, not just some, not just ones that like him, but thinking about the nation and all of the people in an inclusive way. That's should be a minimum amount that we can at least begin to judge a presidency.
Yeah. I was in
Look
the
at that.
chat.
Troy put it. I'm sorry, Troy said enlightened stewardship and humility. Look at that. Troy.
Yeah. Yeah, I was chatting back and forth with Troy when you were talking. My brother worked in the Carter press corps. And I was telling Troy, my brother's kind of Oscar the Grouch. He doesn't really like anybody on the surface, but he always spoke very highly of both Carter and Mondale, both when he was there in the moment and now years later when he's, for years been like tracking down dirty politicians and crooked lawyers and business people that were, cheating the public. For him to still say nice things 60 years later about them tells you something.
I want to respond to what Linda said. That's what MAGA folk believe that Trump does, right? Serving the national good. I'm sure they would say that, but can they actually say he is serving all Americans? LGBTQ, for example, trans people, for example, people who are in this country legally but are immigrants, for example? Could we not pick lots and lots of groups and point to very concrete ways in which that presidency was and seemingly is grounded on opposition to groups of Americans or hating on states that don't like him enough? So you could claim he's seeing to the good of the nation, but is he inclusively thinking about the nation as one nation? I mean, I think a good president thinks in an inclusive way about what the nation is. There are ways in which that in and of itself has a lot of roadblocks. Again, what the things I'm saying here on the one hand feel true, and on the other hand, there are all kinds of ways in which you can find ways that they don't fully make sense. But people who are MAGA folks certainly believe that what he's doing is for the good of the nation, but in a spirit that actually serves all Americans and that very clearly believes that all Americans are Americans and deserve a president who is thinking of all of them. You can't honestly say that that is the way in which thus far President Trump has defined himself, his campaign, or his policies. That's my take. I don't think he's claiming to represent all Americans. And I think a lot of people, just starting with trans and LGBTQ folk, they feel attacked. And at any rate, I'll stop.
Right. So speaking of Troy asks, doesn't Carter's life and his former opponents eulogizing him definitively speak to how far the electoral standards have slipped in the most recent election? He's said he's afraid we'll forget what exemplary behavior looks like.
Well, that's a really good point. Historians, yeah, I mean, when I was talking to my undergraduates this fall, and I realized that for most of them, they've grown up in the Trump era. That's their image of, they haven't had what we might consider to be a normal election or, I don't want to say a normal presidency, but they've been their idea of the presidency is very extreme in some ways. And I just hadn't thought about that until listening to them talk. Yeah, no, it's entirely true. And this is part of, again, how you judge a legacy. Well, down the road, if you look back to this time and say, wow, here's a moment when, uh, there were a lot of people not serving in a true public spirit at all, and people in office were not doing much to bolster that, to stand up for that. I think that's a problem, and I think it's very possible that you forget what true public service is, that you forget what a public-minded presidency is. But I think that's why it's so important to keep calling out what we're seeing in that spirit, right? Because many of us here know, in a general sense, not talking partisan politics, what a good presidency is. And if we see something happening that is blatantly serving one person or one small group of rich people, or doing something corrupt, or serving people financially, whatever, you have to call it out. We have to call it out. We have to talk about it. We have to argue about it. We have to explain why it's corrupt. We have to offer people and explain to people what alternatives are. I'm not going to keep talking about an opposition party, but we need to, this is why it's important to be in the moment, pointing out what's wrong. And I don't mean like, oh, I wish you had a different policy about X. I mean things that are blatantly wrong, self-serving, self-interested, wrong. Not, and I saw someone say this on social media, and I believe that this is true too, not simply repeating the wrong thing. So not just giving more airplay to the wrong thing, rather speaking up with common sense about the right thing. So what the president has said about X really makes me think about why. And why is important and why serves us all and whatever. Not giving free airplay, but responding to it all. And responding to it all, and I say this as someone, a college professor who teaches at an Ivy League institution, not responding with a bunch of four-syllable words and talking about isms. Responding in a very straightforward way. There are too many gun metaphors in the human language. Point blank, right? Just speaking plainly, clearly, in a way that makes everything very clear and not resorting to legal speak or academic speak or ways in which, I sound different if I'm speaking to a group of historians, not a lot, but some, than if I'm actually out speaking generally. I don't sound as different as I should, and so that's a whole different what do I want to say? Bucket of fish, kettle of fish, whatever it is. At any rate, I guess that's I'll stick with that. That's part of my answer to that question. I'm so caught up with this that I'm like losing track of
I
the
know.
conversation.
Miranda's they are in Illinois where it's also very cold, she says. And she was commenting in the chat about there's been some disruption in terms of the Lincoln Presidential Library and the Historical Society. There's been kind of a ruckus the last couple of years. I've been trying to follow it a little bit because I was invited to go there and got kind of caught in the middle of it, but my plane got delayed and I never made it. But Miranda is wondering will the timing of President Carter's death and the funeral cast a shadow on the inauguration and the first 100 days? And she was wondering if there's a way to make Jimmy Carter kind of the focal point to get through this time. So she was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I mean, I think if you are looking for a president, and again, kind of where I started, who did, whether you agree with everything he did or not, served with the public, his sense of the public interest at heart, yeah, now might be a good time to think about that. Now, I don't know if this has been resolved, but at some point when I wasn't moving, I saw that flags will be at half mast for a certain number of days after a president dies. So they will be at half mast during the inauguration. And then I read that President Trump wants to overrule that, of course, so that the flags aren't going to be flown at half mast. And then I lost track of that conversation. So, half staff, thank you. I don't know if that was resolved or not. 30 days, thank you. I don't know if that is still up in the air. But at any rate, no, I think given the timing of President Carter's death, that is a fine thing to think about right now. It's to talk about, the presidents that have led up to this moment and what he embodied as president and what we think the presidency is and should be. Now I'm going to sound like a historian, But as we come up to an inauguration and, the sort of arbitrary first 100 days, as we are in this moment coming up to an inauguration, of course we should be talking about what the presidency is and what the presidency should be and what the presidency shouldn't be. I mean, we are entering a dangerous moment in American history. I'm just going to say it. I don't speak for NCHE. I speak for myself. This is a dangerous moment. This is a perilous moment. And we have someone coming into office who does not believe that the presidency is generally what we all think the presidency should be. Even if you're MAGA, I think you're going to be surprised by some of what comes in the next few years. Given that, we should, all of us, people with a public platform, but all of us should be thinking about and talking about what the presidency is. Whenever I talk about the presidency, what comes to mind for me is, and I know I've talked about it before, so forgive me, is a document that I saw at Mount Vernon. It's George Washington's copy of the Constitution. And he went through, and in the margin, next to everything that involved the presidency, he wrote, I think, executive, executive, executive. He was trying to figure out his job,
Mhm.
and he was marking down all the various parts of his job. That to me, first of all, he was the first, right? So he was defining it, and he didn't know what it was, and it wasn't a king. And he understood that whatever he was going to be doing, it had really important limits, right? If you're going to be thinking about presidential limits, the first guy in that job after a king is really going to be thinking about limits. So that you judge Washington, that's one way in which he certainly was trying very hard to show people the ways in which he was limiting his power. But the fact that he went through and said, okay, here are the specific things the Constitution says I'm supposed to be doing. That's someone who's trying to understand and embody the office as he thinks it was intended in the Constitution. Of course, he was at the Constitutional Convention presiding, so he also had an inside point of view, but still, that's a person who's trying to figure out in a sincere way what the job is. Obviously, with hundreds of years, we don't have to do that anymore, but wouldn't it be nice to imagine that everyone who takes that office sits and thinks about what, in a national way, in a public-minded way, they want their presidency to add up to? Isn't that a nice thought? I don't think every president does it.
Mm.
But wouldn't it be nice to think that presidents who take office, and this is actually a really sad question for me to ask. Wouldn't it be nice to imagine that every president who takes office actually has a heart and soul moment of trying to figure out what the office and the country should be, how he should serve the public, what kind of legacy would he wish his presidency to have? Um, I can't speak for what presidents think when they take office, and certainly the difficulty that it takes to become president is totally possible. People take office and they're just like, I won, and for initially, like that's where they are. I don't know. In my heart of hearts, need to believe that most presidents are thinking about what they want their presidency to add up to in a broad-minded way, in a national way, with a realization that that office, the national executive, is a special kind of leader with a special kind of power and a special kind of meaning in what they do. And you can deploy those things for the sweeping, broad national good that they should be deployed to serve. And presidents, ideally speaking, we elect them, so we're responsible for who we give the office to. But ideally speaking, you would hope that a president is thinking about the office in that way and thinking about what they want it to add up to in a public-minded way, in a way that can get beyond one president's ego.
Yeah.
Steve
Like
says,
I'm processing, like I'm,
yeah, I know. Steve says he's a special kind of someone for sure. And yeah, it's heartbreaking where we are. It's frightening where we are. Um, I'm not going to deny that at all. Um, I'm not. I'm going to be really loud for the next couple of years, and we should all be loud. We should all speak up. Um, op-ed writers, Katie, op-ed writers, right? People should just be speaking up in every way they possibly can, supporting others who have platforms and encouraging them to speak up. And I actually, um, the response to some of what I've said in the past about what it means to be in opposition, some people have said to me in one way or another, great, a bunch more, it's just words, more words. So people are going to be throwing around more words. And I'm actually not talking about standing behind a platform, having press conferences, which are important. I'm, I really think, and the president, this is about the presidency. We are in a moment that demands really creative, imaginative, focused on the moment. I don't want to call it statecraft, politics. We need to be creatively politicking right now. And we, meaning people who are not happy about what's going to be coming down the road. This is a moment you can respond to this moment and say, oh, we're doomed. I think that's what's the best word I want to use for them? I don't think you surrender in advance, and that is what that feels like to me. I do think we're going to need to be creative in how we respond to this moment and what we're seeing the presidency and what it is and what it's being. So what that imaginative politics, what that new brand of politics looks like, I'm talking about what I think, the Democratic Party should be. But the fact of the matter is, we the people are going to have to do the same thing. And we're going to have to do that in part by judging as it goes along the president and the presidency and thinking about what it appears the legacy of this is going to be emotionally, spiritually, as far as statecraft is concerned, as far as the national good is concerned, as far as national unity is concerned. We need to be thinking about the broad national good. We need to be, and we need to be finding ways to speak out that will not sound like someone standing behind a podium making a press statement or well, I don't even necessarily think because the Women's March to me showed that you can have many, many, many people protesting and marching and the press can still ignore us. So I don't know. We have to be creative, and maybe this is for another episode, actually. We have to be creative in thinking about how one can be not in a position of political power, but be in this moment and be useful in the way that one speaks up with a voice of opposition and protest. And now I've once again, sorry guys, I'm like, normally I could keep up with the chat, but it's a combination of, yes, locally. Thank you, Linda. Locally. And that's what I mean is you can talk about organizations, you can talk about big sweeping things, you can talk about people in office and people with big public platforms. But the fact of the matter is, and we've talked about this here before too, we need to be thinking locally. And that doesn't mean if it's local, if it's your town, that it doesn't matter. If people are acting locally, it adds up. It does matter. And you can have a huge impact in a smaller pond. You can have a huge impact. So that's all part of this moment. But again, it involves sort of being legacy minded now, thinking about what a presidency seems to be adding up to as it's going along, thinking about what the legacy appears to be adding up to, being legacy minded and how we are evaluating an ongoing presidency, I guess is part of what I'm talking about. The Women's March, yeah, Nancy, I didn't mean to say the Women's March didn't inspire everyone. It did. What frustrated me was that it didn't get a lot of coverage. It inspired people who took part in it and people who of a certain sort who were watching it, but it should have had a bigger impact. And that frustrated me. But that's me personally. Um, Thank you. Yeah, that just frustrated the heck out of me. I'm being honest. Oh, now people are yelling poof. So we are, is there any one more question we should do, or are we at the poof moment?
Um, Rabbi Beth had one, and I like it. It might be a nice way to wrap it up. She says, we talk so much about the influence of the media in politics today. Could you comment on the role of the media during Carter's presidency? And are there other presidential legacies significantly affected by the media of their time?
Well, I can't speak with great precision about the media during Carter's presidency, I can say that the media has an enormous role on it, that it plays with every presidency, because how can you translate what a president is and what a president is doing to the nation? In a sense, it's the position that is the most removed from the American people and needs the most translation and publicity in government, right? I mean, at least if you're members of Congress, you're supposed to know what they're doing. They're supposed to be reporting to you. Who knows if they're telling the truth? But even members of Congress, as abstract and as removed as they may appear, in a sense, we feel that the presidency is closer because there's one person, and we sort of, in one way or another, for better and worse, own a president. But the fact is, that's very far removed. So, it's like in the when Jefferson, let's see, when did he say this? Um, in the 1790s, when he was thinking about talking about, and a lot of people were talking about what kind of coverage, or let me put it a different way, should the press be allowed into the Senate? Should the press be allowed into the House? Should the press be allowed to see government in action? And Jefferson, this is going to be a bad paraphrase, said something along the lines of, a government, a Congress that people can't see what's going on is going to be the most corrupt institution on the face of the earth. So, we've talked about this before too, how the press, in a sense, is a fourth branch of government. I think that's very true. It has a job to do. In this current moment, I have a lot of thoughts about that and what's been happening and what hasn't been happening, and I'm not the only one. I'm not going to go into that right now. But yeah, the short answer of part to my very long answer to that question is the press, in a sense, is the defining key to what a presidency adds up to. Because how else do we know what it is? This, I'll stop again, but it gets back to opposition, right? If you're not relying on the press, but you yourself are taking action to publicize things, makes me think of when there was that gun control rally in the House, and they turned off the cameras. Uh, and so members of Congress who were there in that protest overnight, or for a chunk of the night, took out their cell phones, and they were showing the nation what was going on without the press mediating in between. And I stayed up and I watched that, because that to me was stunningly fascinating. That was politicians directly communicating to the public and saying, press, you're not going to cover this? Cameras are going to be shut down? Fine. Here you go, American public. Here's what's going on. That was crucially important. And I think we need to be thinking in creative ways like that now.
Well, that's how we found out about George Floyd, because that woman,
Yes.
she streamed the whole thing in real time, as horrifying as it was.
Well, and that's true on a whole different level, right? As far as crime and how law enforcement treats Black individuals, and how they are treated and what they are blamed for. And now that we have people with cameras who can capture that, that's a new era. So for sure,
Yeah.
but that can apply just as well to people in office, and it should.
And I was reading this morning, with the wildfires, they were talking about looting. They've arrested 40 some people already for looting houses that were burnt down before the families could get back. And they said somehow miraculously, some of the ring cameras on people's accounts were still working, even if part of the house was damaged. And they had evidence on these ring cameras of people looting other people's houses. And so the person is evacuated, they're staying with a relative, and they're watching someone come in and loot their own home or loot their neighbor's home, but they're
Oh,
turning that over to the police, and the police have caught 40 people that way.
okay, well, that's good. I was about to be horrified, but
Yeah, no, I was like, wow, like, it's hard to get away with stuff now. So, okay, I know we're over time, Claire.
yeah,
There's a few more questions. Maybe send them to us.
yeah.
I'm going to sneak a couple into the after party because I think they're more after party questions.
Okay, so let me explain what that means for those who are here and have not been here before. Okay, so what we are going to do now is go to the after party. What that means is that we will no longer be recording what we're doing, so that we can be even freer and easier with our conversation and talk about whatever the heck we want to talk about. If you beamed in through the NCHE website, just stay right where you are, and poof, you will be in the after party. If you are watching us on Facebook, You need to leave Facebook and go to ncheteach.org/conversations. That's ncheteach.org/conversations. And then you too will poof be in the after party. I thank you guys for being here in this first episode in my new apartment. I It makes it feel like home all of a sudden that the History Matters community is here with me at this moment of total chaos. Um, Everyone have a safe week. Uh, Thank you for being here and engaging in the conversation of democracy. We're going to need this conversation so badly in weeks and months to come, and we will be here for it. This community will be here doing what you should be doing in a democratic form of government, and that is watching what's going on, questioning it, talking about it, engaging with other people to figure out what we think about it. That's why this kind of community matters, in addition to history mattering. So, thank you guys for being here. Thank you to Annie and Claire and NCHE and John and Jessica. I can't forget people. Everyone gets a big thank you. And I will see you guys next Friday, which will be after my first week going back to teaching. So, um, at any rate, okay.
Okay, so everybody has been wanting to know how the move went, but first,
Wait, we're
Carol.
still okay. We're still recording.
Oh, sorry. I was so excited to get started on the after party.
We need to stop the recording.